안녕하세요. 신한은행의 오건영입니다. 오늘 연합뉴스경제TV에서 특별한 시간을 준비해 주셨습니다. 저기 Cme에서 근무하시는 굉장히 유명한 이코노미스트시고요. 에릭 롤랜드님을 모시고 말씀을 좀 나눠보는 그런 시간을 준비를 했습니다.
Good to see you.
Yeah, okay. Can you introduce yourself to Korean watchers?
Certainly, yes. My name is Eric Norland. I work for Cme가 as their senior economist based in London. And my role is basically to follow every major economy in the world from the United States to Europe to China to Korea to Japan.
한국에 여러 번 오신 걸로 알고 있는데 어떠신가요?
Oh, I love Korea. I think this is my 8th trip to Korea. And I really enjoy being here. I love the people and the food is phenomenal.
알겠습니다. 네, 본격적으로 시장 질문 좀 드려보도록 하겠습니다. 이게 지난해 말, 이제 올해 초만 해도 미국의 리세션 가능성이 거의 100%에 달한다는 이런 주장이 힘을 얻었었는데요. 근데 올해 상반기에 참 이례적으로 주식시장도 굉장히 강한 모습을 보이고 있고 노랜딩이라는 단어까지 나오고 있습니다. 여기에 대해서는 어떤 의견이 있으신지, 그리고 이런 이례적인 현상이 나타나는 원인이 뭔지 거기에 대한 의견 부탁드리겠습니다.
Yeah, so I think you're right. A year ago, there were many economists who were forecasting an economic downturn would happen this year because of all the Fed rate hikes.
Yes.
I'm proud to say my colleagues and I were not among those economists. We felt that the economy was going to grow in the first half of this year at least, but that as we got into late 2023, the risk of a recession were going to start rising. I think that economists underestimated a couple things. I think, first of all, they underestimated the lag time between when the central bank raises rates and when there's an actual economic downturn. And that lag can be very long, like 1 to 2 years' time. Secondly, last fall, the U.S. Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which involved $1 trillion in spending. And some of that money has begun to be spent, which has caused the U.S. economy to outperform most other economies around the world.
오케이. 그럼 추가 질문을 좀 드려보면 결국에는 미국의 경기가 그래도 생각보다 강하다라는 말씀에 대해서는 참 고무적이다라는 생각이 들지만 이게 다른 면에서 보면은 지금의 인플레이션을 좀 더 스티키하게 만드는 그런 문제들이 생길 수 있지 않겠습니까? 그럼 어쩌면 연준에서 생각하는 경기 침체가 얻는 물가 안정, 이게 과연 가능할지 여기에 대해서 좀 의견을 부탁드리겠습니다.
Yeah, so I'll take that question in two parts. So first of all, I think inflation in the United States has come down to a remarkable extent.
Yes.
Core inflation, the core CPI, peaked at 6.6% year on year in the middle of 2022. That's now down to 4.1%. And of that 4.1%, most of that is coming from one component, which is rental costs and owner's equivalent rent. Now that one component, if you take it out, inflation at the core level in the US is running below 2%. So inflation in the US already seems like it's come back under control. And I think the risk here is that the Fed, which raised interest rates by 525 basis points, its biggest rate hike since 1981, has over-tightened policy and is at risk of creating an unnecessary economic downturn.
네, 결국에는 이제 물가에 대해서도 어느 정도 객관적인 시각을 말씀해 주시긴 했는데 그럼에도 불구하고 예측이 힘들어지는 이유 중 하나가 임금과 에너지 가격이 아닌가 싶습니다. 특히 이제 UAW죠, 그러니까 전미 자동차 노조를 비롯해서 미국에서 이제 임금 스트라이크가 굉장히 많이 일어난다는 게 1번이고, 그 다음에 러시아 우크라이나 전쟁뿐만 아니라 이 하마스 사태까지 굉장히 지오폴리티컬한 그런 이슈들이 어쩌면 에너지 가격을 자극할 수 있다라는 그런 얘기들도 계속해서 회자가 되고 있습니다. 그렇다면 어쩌면 약간은 좀 안정되었다라고 말씀해 주시는 이런 인플레이션이 다시금 불거지게 되는, 이런 사태가 다시금 불거지게 되는 그런 가능성을 좀 염두에 둘 수 있지 않을까요?
Yeah, so first of all, when it comes to geopolitical risks and the outbreak of war between Israel and Hamas, that seems to have had a sort of temporary impact on energy prices. The ultimate impact is very difficult to say. We don't know if it's going to become worse or not as bad. But central banks, generally speaking, are not focused on energy prices because they know they're volatile and they believe that they tend to mean revert. What is a greater concern is wages. Yeah, so when it comes to wages, though, this is a bigger long-term concern. Wages in the U.S. are currently growing at a little bit over 4% per year, which is quite a lot faster than productivity, which has been growing at more like 1.5% to 2% per year. The pace of wage growth is running now about 1% to 2% higher than it was before the pandemic. So that might suggest that rather than returning to a 2% inflation rate, long-term inflation may settle closer to 2.5%, 3%, maybe 3.5%. But nobody really knows. That's the problem. And outside of the U.S., if you look at Western Europe, their wage growth is much higher. It's more like 5%, 6%, which may explain why inflation in Europe is stickier and higher than it is in the U.S.
결국에는 이제 임금에 대한 말씀을 좀 해주셨는데, 저도 이제 고민하는 것 중에 하나가 지금의 인플레이션이 사실은 그 연준의 목표치인 2%인가 2%를 넘어선 게 21년도 3월로 알고 있습니다. 근데 지금이 이제 23년도 10월, 11월이니까 2년 7개월째 목표치를 넘어서 있는 상태인데, 만약에 이런 상태가 더 이어지게 된다면 이제 일각에서 고민하는 것처럼 이 인플레이션 자체가 인트렌치드니까 결국에는 고착화되는 거 아니냐, 이제 이런 고민들이 좀 있는데요. 그럼 사실상 고착화 문제는 1970년대와 같은 이슈를 좀 만들어내지 않을까 싶은데.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a very important question in terms of what happens to asset prices and long-term interest rates. There are two opposing arguments. So I'll give you first the argument for why it might become entrenched. So first, as we discussed, wages are growing more quickly. Related to that, you have a large generation of people retiring and a somewhat smaller generation of people entering the labor force in the U.S. And that is even more true in places like China, Japan, Korea, and Western Europe that have more rapidly aging populations. In addition to that, you also have rising geopolitical tensions, which means potentially more military spending around the world, which is inherently inflationary and inefficient. And then lastly, you have essentially a breakdown of free trade around the world and a lot more nearshoring, onshoring, friendshoring that's also potentially inflationary. So the counter argument is that we still have very, very rapidly advancing technology. So in recent years, we've been talking a lot about generative AI. Which serves, I think, as a direct threat against many, many services professions, including lawyers and writers, and could potentially keep their wages down. And then we also have very rapidly falling costs for alternative energies. Solar energy, wind energy, battery storage. Those prices are falling at 60% to 70% per decade. And this is also potentially very disinflationary.
이제 지금 결국에는 인플레이션 요소와 디플레이션 요소가 남아있다라는 것에 대해서는 같이 말씀을 해주셨는데요. 이게 이슈가 되는 이유 중에 하나가 투자자들 입장에서는 결국에는 미국의 국채 금리가 높아지고 있다라는 그런 것 때문에 좀 우려점이 좀 많은 것 같습니다. 최근 이렇게 금리가 치솟는 이유가 무엇인지, 그리고 향후에도 이런 흐름이 이어지게 될 것인지, 사실상 방금 전에 말씀드렸던 이 인플레이션 고착화라는 게 지금의 높은 금리가 구조적인 것인지 아니면 템포러리 일시적인 것인지, 그걸 가릴 수 있는 핵심이 될 거라고 생각하는데 거기에 대한 의견을 좀 여쭤봅니다.
Yes, I think there's a number of reasons why bond yields have been rising. First, as we discussed earlier, we've had exceptionally strong economic growth in the U.S. over the last 6 months or so, perhaps related to the Inflation Reduction Act and all of that spending. Secondly, Japan has been decontrolling its yield curve. Their yields have been capped at 25 basis points on Japanese 10 years, and it went to 50. As of this recording, they're trading at 88 basis points. That's reducing Japanese demand to buy bonds around the world. And then lastly, central banks, including the Federal Reserve most famously, but not only the Federal Reserve, have been talking up this idea of higher interest rates for longer. And all of these have been pushing long-term bond yields higher in recent weeks.
네. 네. 중앙은행에 관련된 질문을 좀 드려볼 수밖에 없을 것 같은데요. 예, 첫 번째는 이제 일본에 대한 말씀을 좀 해주셨습니다. 근데 결국에는 지금 일본이 일드 커브 컨트롤을 갖다가 이제 약간씩은 좀 약화시키고 있는 분위기지 않습니까? 근데 이제 일각에서는 이거를 유지할 수 있다 혹은 없다라는 데 대한 주장들이 굉장히 좀 많은 것 같습니다. 이 일본이 결국에는 마이너스 금리하고 그 다음에 이 말씀드렸던 것처럼 일드 커브 컨트롤을 종국에는 이벤추얼리는 결국에는 해제할 수밖에 없을지 거기에 대한 의견을 좀.
So I think they're probably moving towards abolishing it for a very simple reason. They were able to implement these policies or even desired these policies because for many decades inflation was around zero, sometimes even negative. And so when Japan began to experience inflation about 2 years ago, initially people were very content because finally inflation had come up to their 2% target. The problem is inflation did not stop at 2%. So now Japan's core rate of inflation, ex fresh food and energy, is now up to 4.2% year on year, which is twice as high as their target. And so the central bank is now trying to figure out what to do about it. And they are in this sort of unique position of being the only central bank outside of China that has not tightened policy.
저기 이제 결국에는 페드에 대한 질문, 연준에 대한 질문도 좀 드려봐야 될 것 같은데요. 연준이 이제 higher for longer라는 얘기를 좀 하고 있지만 일각에서는 2% 물가 목표에 어느 정도 수렴을 하게 되면 그때부터는 또 이제 급격하게 과거처럼 기준금리를 낮출 수도 있다. 이제 이런 기대를 갖고 있는 사람들이 있습니다. 근데 그거하고 반대로 얼마 전에 이제 스위스 내셔널 뱅크에서 이제 얘기했던 것들이 그쪽 같은 경우는 이미 물가 목표 2% 밑으로 인플레이션이 내려왔음에도 불구하고 향후에 다시 한번 인플레이션이 튀어오를 것에 대한 걱정을 굉장히 많이 하는 것 같은데요. 연준 같은 경우는 2%에 어느 정도 다가오는 모습을 보이면 과거처럼 빠른 경기 부양을 위해서 노력하게 될 것인지 그 패턴이 반복될 것인지에 대한 의견을 좀 부탁드리겠습니다.
Yeah, so in the U.S. we were on a 40-year-long downtrend in interest rates from the early 1980s until 2020. Now we have finally broken that pattern. And the U.S. has the highest short-term interest rate since 2000, the highest long-term interest rate since around 2010 or so. And what I think is really determinant about the Fed is whether or not the economy goes into a recession. During the last 3 recessions, the one in the early 90s, the one in 2001, and the one in 2008 and 2009, in each case, the Federal Reserve cut interest rates by 500 basis points or more. So if we have a downturn with core inflation already falling, even before a downturn has begun, we could wind up with very low inflation and the Fed could wind up back near zero rates. But as you rightly point out, if inflation remains stickier, the Fed may not be able to cut as much.
저기 결국 이번에 이제 미국의 재정 적자에 대한 질문을 좀 드려보겠습니다. 이 재정 적자에 대한 우려가 굉장히 커진 것 같은데요. 적자 자체가 크다는 것도 문제지만 이게 높아진 금리 때문에 이자 부담이 더욱더 커지게 되면서 이 저장 적자가 굉장히 좀 오랫동안 이어지게 되고 해결이 어려울 것이다. 성장률보다 오히려 금리가 높아지게 되면 빚이 더 늘어나는 구조가 되니까 사람들이 여기에 대해서는 굉장히 좀 어렵게 바라보고 있는 것 같습니다. 그러면 재정 적자가 이렇게 늘어나게 된다면 향후에도 인플레이션을 제외하고서도 꽤 금리를 갖다가 높여줄 수 있는 요인이 될 수도 있을 것 같은데 여기에 대한 의견은 좀 어떠실까요?
Yes, this is a really good question. U.S. government debt before the global financial crisis was 60% of gross domestic product. Now it's close to 100% of GDP. And the budget deficit is still very, very large. During the pandemic, the budget deficit grew to nearly 20% of GDP. Currently, it's still running at around 7% of GDP, which is very, very high. And part of the reason why it's still high is because the government's cost of financing has suddenly risen. So the government's cost of financing has risen enough to probably add about 1% of GDP or so to the budget deficit, maybe a little less. But that will continue to rise over time if the Federal Reserve maintains high interest rates. Now, what I think is of concern this time is that when you look at the Fed's past tightening cycles, the one at the end of the 80s, the end of the 90s, then the one ending in 2006, all of those resulted in recessions. But going into those recessions, the budget deficits in each case were relatively small.
Yeah.
And in fact, in the end of the 1990s, actually had a budget surplus. So that allowed the federal government to raise spending or cut taxes when we had a recession. Yeah. This time around, that might not be possible given the size of the deficit. So the entire burden for supporting the economy will fall on the shoulders of the Federal Reserve. So this is an argument that they may have to lower interest rates a great deal if we have a recession, even if inflation is maybe not completely back under control.
그러면 사실상 지금 이제 조금 혼란스럽지만 달러에 대한 질문을 좀 드려볼 수밖에 없을 것 같아요. 첫 번째는 결국에는 연준이라든지 연준의 하이어 for longer 스탠스라든지 아니면은 다소 과거보다 높은 금리가 이어진다라는 것들, 이런 것들은 미국의 금리 자체가 높아졌기 때문에 달러의 강세를 지지하는 요인이 되겠지만 뒤집어 썼을 때는 미국의 재정 적자가 과거보다 많이 커졌다라는 것은 반대편에서는 달러의 약세를 지지하는 요인이 될 수가 있습니다. 어쩌면 많은 분들이 지금 달러 강세가 부담스럽기 때문에 머지않은 미래에는 달러가 약세로 전환될 수 있다, 이런 기대를 갖고 있었지만 이런 달러 강세가 생각보다 그런 기대에도 불구하고 생각보다 오랫동안 유지가 되는 것 같습니다. 실제 달러 강세가 달러 약세로의 전환이 가능하다고 생각하시는지, 그 시점은 어느 정도로 보시는지 그 질문을 좀 드려봅니다.
Yes, I think that there is a significant chance of a weaker dollar in 2024 and 2025. Essentially, there are four forces that act on currencies. So the two forces pulling up the dollar have been the growth differential. U.S. economic growth has been stronger than in most other countries. Secondly, as you rightly point out, U.S. interest rates have been significantly higher than they have been in most other countries, and that's also been attracting capital into the dollar. On the other hand, you have the countervailing force of the bigger budget deficit in the U.S. and most other countries that's been pulling the dollar downwards or preventing it from rising more quickly in any case. Unless you have the trade deficit, which in the U.S. has been actually quite stable. It's actually been falling a little bit as U.S. energy production grows. That's been slightly supportive for the dollar. My fear for the dollar is that the Federal Reserve has over-tightened policy. And it will reduce the growth differential. The U.S., instead of leading growth, will lead the world into a downturn. And then the Federal Reserve will have to very suddenly reduce interest rates. And when that happens, that could translate into a lot of dollar weakness.
달러에 대한 질문하고 이어지는 게 결국에는 이머징 마켓에 대한 투자에 대한 질문인 것 같습니다. 지난 10여 년 동안의 흐름을 보면은 결국에는 선진국에 투자하는 것들이, 특히 미국을 중심으로 한 선진국에 투자하는 게 이머징에 투자하는 것보다 훨씬 더 좋은 성과를 갖다 가져온 게 사실입니다. 그리고 많은 분들이 앞으로도 그런 모습은 이어질 것이다 라고 생각을 하는데, 실제로 그런 것들이 달러가 말씀해 주셨던 것처럼 급격한 약세로 전환되는 시나리오가 만약 가능하다면 우리가 2000년도 달러 강세 이후에 나타났었던 2001년 이후에 나타났었던 어쩌면 꽤 긴 기간의 달러 약세, 거기서 나타나는 이머징 시장의 새로운 모멘텀, 이런 것들을 기대해 볼 수 있을지 그 질문을 한번 드려봅니다.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it depends where you're investing. I would say in general, if you're looking as an equity investor, many emerging markets have very low equity valuation levels, whereas the U.S. equity valuations are extremely high. So on the equity side, I think that emerging markets are interesting to look at. When it comes to the fixed income side, though, I think it's more difficult. Many emerging markets, countries, have seen tremendous increases in interest rates. For example, in Latin America, you've seen much bigger increases in interest rates than in the United States. And that could eventually translate into higher default rates on bonds and things like that. So I think it really depends a lot on which asset class you're talking about.
그럼 자연스럽게 한국 시장에 대한, 코리안 마켓에 대한 질문을 좀 드려볼 수가 있을 것 같은데요. 지금 이제 이머징 시장에서 어떻게 보면 에코티 마켓 쪽에서는 좀 기회를 찾아볼 수 있겠다라는 말씀해 주셨는데, 신흥국 중에서 조금 더 특별하게 들어가서 여기서 이제 한국 투자에 대해서는 그리고 우리나라 경제에 대해서는 어떤 의견을 갖고 계신지 그 질문을 좀 드려봅니다.
Right. So, first of all, I don't consider Korea to be in any way an emerging market. It was an emerging market 30 years ago. Now Korea's per capita income is basically the same as Western Europe, and not much different than Japan. So Korea, to my mind, is not really an emerging market at all. But what is interesting about the stock market here, and it's also true in China and Japan and many other countries, is that the valuation levels are not particularly high compared to the US. So if you're a long-term investor and you're very patient, it's conceivable you could get a higher return in a market like the Korean market that doesn't have valuation levels that are as high as what we're seeing in the US.
네, 굉장히 반가운 말씀 해주셔서 참 감사드리고요. 여기서 이제 한 가지만 더 질문을 좀 드려보겠습니다. 지난 꽤 긴 기간 동안, 20-30년 기간 동안 많이 유행을 했었던 게 주식 시장에 60%를 투자하고 채권 시장에 40%를 투자하는 60-40 포트폴리오가 굉장히 좀 인기를 끌었다라고 합니다. 근데 이 포트폴리오가 지난 2-3년 동안은 워킹을 하지 않는 모습이었는데요. 요거하고 또 하나 좀 볼 수 있었던 게 선진국과 신흥국에 분산 투자하는 지역 분산형 포트폴리오도 인기를 끌었는데 이게 선진국 쪽에서는 양호한 성과를 냈지만 신흥국 쪽에서는 좀 부진한 성과를 내면서 지난 10년간의 투자에서는 큰 재미를 못 본 게 사실인 것 같습니다. 그러면 앞으로의 10년을 봤을 때 물론 이걸 예단한다는 건 굉장히 어렵겠지만 앞으로의 10년을 보셨을 때 60-40 포트폴리오는 여전히 유용한지 그 다음에 선진국과 신흥국에 분산 투자하는 포트폴리오는 여전히 유용한지 그 질문을 좀 드려봅니다.
All right, well, let's take it separately. Let's first talk about the 60-40 portfolio. So the 60-40 portfolio worked exceptionally well between roughly, I'd say, 1998 and the end of 2021 for basically three reasons. First, stock prices went up. Secondly, bond yields fell, which means that bond prices went up. And then third, there was a negative correlation between stocks and bonds, which meant that the owners of the 60-40 portfolio were getting an exceptionally high risk-adjusted return because on days when stocks were up, bonds tended to be down, and on days when bonds were down, stocks tended to be up. But they were overall going up with a negative correlation. So the important thing to know about the 60-40 portfolio, though, is that stocks don't always go up. Bonds don't always go up. So in 2022, for example, both of them went down together, and they became positively correlated. And the positive correlation was something that was a standard feature of markets during the 1970s and 1980s, and really all the way up until 1997 and 1998. Why? Because at that time, the main fear was higher inflation. So when you would get really strong economic data, people would fear the central bank would raise rates, long-term interest rates would go up, and stocks would go down, and bond prices would fall. That correlation has begun to reappear because people are becoming more afraid of inflation than deflation. So what happens to the 60-40 portfolio depends crucially on what happens to inflation. If we have a recession, inflation starts going back towards zero, the correlation will go towards zero again, or it will become negative again, rather. On the other hand, if inflation persists or becomes higher and higher like it did in the 70s, then the 60-40 portfolio could be a disaster. During the last decade, really since the beginning of 2009, we had this exceptional performance of technology stocks, which is the main reason why the US outperformed not just emerging markets, but outperformed almost all of the other developed markets. But there are interesting exceptions to that. There are two other economies with a lot of technology stocks. There's India and there's Israel. And both of their stock markets were also major outperformers. So this is not really a story to my mind of developed markets versus emerging markets. It's a story of technology stocks versus everything else. And it's important to remember that technology stocks can have these spectacular periods, but they can also go back down. For example, from 2000 to 2002, the NASDAQ index fell 85%. So the technology industry may not be on a one-way street higher.
이런 점들을 고려해서 저는 이제 결국에는 포트폴리오를 하는 이유가 이런 불확실성들을 좀 반영해서 진행하는 거라고 생각을 합니다. 그러면 2024년 어떻게 보면 이 인플레이션 때문에 과거에 해왔었던 이 패턴들이 많이 깨질 수도 있다는 생각이 드는데요. 2024년 수많은 투자자들이 가져갈 수 있는 안정적인 포트폴리오 전략 이런 게 있다면 무엇인지 좀 말씀해 주시고요. 그리고 그 와중에서도 우리가 경계해야 되는 어떤 리스크 지표 이런 것들이 있다면 그런 이슈가 있다면 좀 말씀을 부탁드리겠습니다.
Well, I think one of the appealing and interesting portfolio strategies is one that balances the risk between bonds, equities, and other assets like gold. So gold is an asset we haven't really spoken about, but gold has near zero correlation to stocks and near zero correlation to bonds, at least long-term bonds. It's actually very negatively correlated with short-term interest rates. And so gold could be a potentially very, very interesting portfolio diversifier in a world in which U.S. equities are potentially very overvalued and potentially facing a recession. And long-term bond yields are, potentially going to remain high even if the Fed reduces short-term interest rates. And gold hasn't done very well in the last 3 years because I think that gold investors don't like the fact that the Fed hiked rates by 525 basis points. But if the Fed starts cutting rates, that could be very bullish for gold. For risk factors next year? Yeah, well, I think there's obviously many, many risk factors for next year. But I think the biggest one, the single biggest one, is going to be the consequences from all of the tightening of interest rates around the world. 525 basis points of rate hikes in the US. That's the biggest rate hike since 1981. Huge interest rate increases throughout Latin America, Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Korea, Singapore, many other countries, India, South Africa. Interest rate increases tend to hit the economy with a delay of 1 to 2 years. So I think in 2024 and 2025 will be the years in which we feel the true consequence of all of this policy tightening. And I think that's probably the single biggest risk factor.
마지막으로 오늘 이 인터뷰에 대한 소감과 그리고 한국 투자자분들한테 마지막 좀 인사 말씀 부탁드리겠습니다.
Oh, it was a great pleasure to be back here. I was here, I think, last December, and it's great to be back. So thank you so much.
네, 이상으로 Cme의 수석 이코노미스트이신 에릭 놀랜드님을 모시고 굉장히 좀 많은 대화를 나눠봤습니다. 내년에 금리라든지 물가라든지 달러라든지 굉장히 많은 불확실성 속에서도 굉장히 중요한 임플리케이션을 주시는 그런 시간이 아니었나 그렇게 생각됩니다. 투자자분들께 많은 도움 되셨기를 바라면서요. 이상으로 마치겠습니다. 감사합니다.